Let's begin. Welcome everybody, and so we have second half of the Yirmiyahu sessions. I thought what would make the most sense is it's 52 chapters. We're not going to go through it, but to try to pick out pieces of the book that are unique or represent what is special about the book of Yirmiyahu. Every book has its own, like a personality. Every book has its own personality, its own character. And the trick is to try to capture that. It's not easy to do that. What is special, what is unique about the book. And that's really, I think, very central to study in general, study of Tanakh, Torah study. What is special about it? What is the quality that it has? So, Book of Yirmiyahu is one of the three great prophetic works that we have in our tradition. Yeshaya, Yecheskel, Yirmiyahu, three big books. We have the smaller Nevi'im as well, Treasar, etc. But this is one of the big three, and it has its own unique character. I wanted to begin by talking in general about prophecy. We'll have an opportunity, I hope, over the course of these weeks to talk some more about prophecy. The truth is that Heschel has a book called The Prophets, and it's actually very interesting. His approach to prophecy, which is in some way rooted in his Hasidic mindset, is very humanistic. In other words, it's not the Rambam's thinking. That was one of his big projects. And of course, when you read the Chumash, you don't get that impression at all. You get the impression that God gets angry, God is upset. That is certainly the impression that one gets in reading the Chumash. Shmuel says in Sefer Shmuel that God is not a human being who changes God's mind. People change their minds. Lo adam hu lehinachem, as Shmuel said in his speech to Shaul in chapter 15 after the Amalek episode. The very same chapter in which Shmuel says that God never changes God's mind has God speaking to Shmuel, and the first word out of God's mouth is Nichamti. It's the first word, actually the last word of the chapter. Vashem Nicham. So it's both attested to by God, and then the book attests to it. The last word of the chapter. Vashem Nicham ki yimlicha Shaul. So what do you do with that? It's a good Shmuel question. On one hand, what Shmuel says is playing off the Bilam prophecy, another great prophecy, very important prophecy. Bilam said it. Shmuel says, Bilam says it. On the other hand, the chapter in Shmuel, in the book Shmuel, says the opposite, and the Torah says the opposite. Because in the very beginning of the Chumash, after God creates the world, and not only is God regretting that God created the human being, God was upset or sad. And the word etzev is a very central word in the story of Gan Eden. Going back to the eitz. So it's the eitz and the etzev and the yitzavon, and then God is vayitatzev el libo. So let's put it this way. God is represented in whatever the philosophy is, whatever that is. But the way God is presented in the Bible, beginning with the beginning of the Chumash, is as a being that has feelings, emotions, regrets, anger, etc. The Gemara says, Dibra Torah Bilshon B'nei Adam, whether that is accurate description of the great being or not is a question for philosophers. But in the Chumash, in any event, God has feelings, emotions, upsetness, and anger. That is nowhere more evident in our prophetic writings than the book of Yirmiyahu, which in several places, it's actually hard to tell. We'll have to deal with this. Who is speaking? It's very hard to know often in the book of Yirmiyahu whether Yirmiyahu was speaking or whether God is speaking. As we'll point this out over the course of the next few weeks, at some places it's very hard to tell, but it would appear, at least in some of the places, that God is speaking. Woe unto me, my children have left me, and all this. Sounds like It represents God's feelings and God's emotions. That was the position that Heschel took in his book of the prophets. And he went beyond this, which is, it's actually very interesting, whether you agree with him or not, he's very interesting. And his point is that the prophet has a kind of empathy with God. The prophet empathizes with God. At the same time, the prophet is his own person. So the prophet operates in two different capacities. One is as the human being, whatever the human being may feel. And the prophet also is empathizing with God, feeling God's pain, as it were. That means that whether it's true of all the prophets in general, I don't see this in some of the prophets, and we'll get to that. But in the case of Yirmiyahu, I think we do see it. I was trying to locate the prophets. I have it someplace or other to read through it, big book. But I did go on the internet to see some of the citations from Heschel. And it struck me as very interesting that his first 5 or 6 citations are all from Sefer Yirmiyah. Sefer Yirmiyah, it's true. You know, Yirmiyah, whether it's true globally or not is a good question. But in Yirmiyah, it certainly is true that we have Yirmiyah's feelings as the person, we have God's feelings stated. And then the question is how those two relate to each other. What is Yirmiyah's connection to the God who has sent him on this thankless mission? So that's some of the things we'll be discussing in the course of these weeks. Yeah. Right. Now that is very true. We'll get. That's one of the sessions we'll talk about. He has a writer, and writing is very central to the book. It comes up in 5 or 6 different places. It's very interesting, different kinds of writing, which is very interesting. And he has something else besides a writer. He has a protege. He has a disciple. Baruch ben Neri is not just his he is his writer. But it's clear that he's his trusted confidant. When he is in prison, for example, he can't get out. He wants to deliver the message. So he speaks to Baruch from the jail, and Baruch's outside the jail, writing it all down and delivering the message. So that's another interesting feature of Yirmiyahu. We'll talk about that as well. I thought the way to begin today, by way of introduction, second introduction, but to talk a little bit about the great prophet, the greatest prophet in our tradition, obviously Moshe, and to see how Yirmiyahu and others, see how Moshe is a kind of tipus, as it were, the paradigm for prophecy. And what's interesting is how different biblical texts play off the character of Moshe, including Yirmiyahu and including Yechezkel. And I just want to say that in our study of Yirmiyahu, he's the great prophet. He lives in Israel. He's living there after the first exile, which is very important exile of Yehoiachin, in which essentially all the important people are sent into exile. It's actually very interesting that Yirmiyahu himself is not sent into exile. Maybe it wasn't that important. He says about himself, and now Anochi. He's not living in Jerusalem. He lives in Anatot, which is a city of priests. So we don't know much about that in terms of his standing, but it would appear from just logic that his contemporary prophet, who's slightly younger than he is, but the other great prophet at the same time, and that's why it's good to look at these two prophets together actually, is of course Yechezkel. And not only is he a prophet at the same time, it's also very interesting, he's also a Kohen. These are two Kohanim, basically. Yechezkel is one Kohen, and Yirmiyah is the other. And they're not just priests, but they're the two great prophets of their time. And they live in two different places. Because Yirmiyahu lives in the land. He goes into exile at the very end of his life. He goes down to Egypt. That's another story that we'll deal with also. But for the most part, he's inside the land, doesn't leave, even when he's offered to leave. At the end, after the Jerusalem is destroyed, so the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and his henchmen, they offer Yirmiyahu safe passage out. You come with us, we'll take care of you, no problems. Or if you wish, you could stay in the land. And he decides to stay. Actually, stay with the people, which is very striking. That's part of Yirmiyahu's greatness, I think. He doesn't desert his people. So that's Yirmiyahu. Yechezkel is different. Yechezkel lives in Bavel. Yechezkel's in exile. He's the prophet in exile. Now, both of them prophesy about both places, as we will see. They both prophesy about both places, but the focus is very different. Focus is different in many ways. And actually, Yechezkel, who's actually an extremely interesting book and totally different from anything else that we have, but it casts an interesting light upon Yirmiyahu. So we'll have the opportunity to compare Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu. It's one of the things I really want to think about a lot, and to look at it over the course of these few sessions that we have together. Yes, he does. No, he ends up in Mitzrayim. It's actually very interesting that when you read the book, I should repeat, okay. The question is, where does Yirmiyahu end up? So in Sefer Yirmiyahu, he ends up in Egypt. He ends up in Egypt. Even though, it's interesting, even though in the beginning of the book, the introduction to the book, chapter 1, Asher hayad dvar Hashem elav b'mei Yoshiyahu ben Amotz melech Yehuda b'shlosh esrei shana lemocho v'hi b'yom b'mei Yehoyakim ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda ad tom ashtei esrei shana l'tzidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda ad glot Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi. So it says that these are the words of God came to Yirmiyahu in the 13th year of Yoshiyahu's reign. He's the righteous king. Throughout the days of Yehoyakim, very bad guy, until the end of the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu, when Jerusalem went into exile in the 5th month. Now that actually is not accurate as far as the book is concerned, because in the book, we have prophecies of Yirmiyahu afterwards. Because at the end of the book, and we'll look at this at the end, not this week, the end of the book, after the assassination of Gedaliah is placed by the Babylonians to be the governor of what remains in the land. And the people in the land are very frightened because Gedaliah is assassinated. Yishmael and his group assassinate, and they're afraid that the Babylonians will take revenge on all the inhabitants. So they decide to go to Egypt. And before they go to Egypt, they ask Yirmiyahu to talk to God and to find out what the right path is. So Yirmiyahu says to them, well, I'll find out what the right path is, but I want you to give me assurances that when I find out what the right path is, you will follow the right path. Oh, yes. Anyway, we know the story. So the right path is to stay. Don't leave. The Babylonians will not harm you. It's going to be okay. So they say, no, we're leaving anyway. And they leave, and it would appear that they take Yirmiyahu and Baruch with them. Now, we know he goes with them, and it says they took him. Whether he would have gone in any event, we don't know. So they take him down to Egypt, and in Egypt, there are prophecies. He is warning them about Egypt, about not getting involved with Egypt. And we have actually, it's interesting, when you read the beginning of the book, you don't think there's any prophecy after the destruction of the temple. But there are prophecies at the end, which I find to be the most terrific of all. Because what you have at the end of the book is that Yirmiyahu says to them, listen, you're in trouble over here because you worship foreign gods and idolatry and Ashtaroth and all that stuff. Don't get involved in the idolatry of Egypt, of Mitzrayim. It'll only bring more trouble. And don't think Mitzrayim's going to help you. They won't be able to protect you. To which the response is, and he says, and he says to the men, and your wives were busy serving the queen of heaven, Mulechet HaShamayim, maybe Ashtaroth or something. So the women say to Yirmiyahu the opposite, the other way around. On the contrary, the reason we went into exile is because we didn't worship them enough. We stopped worshiping them. In the time of Yoshiyahu, with all his edicts, we stopped worshiping Mulechet HaShamayim. That's why we're here. Had we continued to worship Asherah, we would have not been in trouble. That's what they say. That's the end of the book, actually. So you got to wonder how Yirmiyahu feels about all this after his all his tirades and all this. And his warning, at the end of the day, they say to him, on the contrary, everything you ever said to us is not so. So that's the story of Yirmiyahu that appears at the very end of the book. And you have to wonder about this figure as a tragic figure. Having said all that, there is also the other side of Yirmiyahu that we hopefully will address over these few sessions, and that is that he talks about redemption and consolation, and this is a very important point for Yirmiyahu and very unique. He gives a time frame. Not just there will be someday consolation, someday the return. He actually gives a time frame of 70 years, which is very striking. He predicts that in 70 years, there will be a return. So 70 years is a long time, it's a lifetime. But in the future, not in some unknown future, is a very specific prophecy of consolation. So despite the fact that most of the book is an attempt to bring people back, and an attempt which apparently, for the most part, doesn't seem to work very well. Having said all that, and maybe this is an important point to mention in terms of our study of the prophets, that is that the messages of the prophets, and the reason the prophecies are written down in part of our tradition, because it's clear there are many prophets, many prophets who didn't have their prophecies written down. So why is the prophecy of these people written down? Why 52 chapters of Yirmiyahu? To which the Gemara says, because it's a prophecy that has relevance to the future as well, which is why we're studying it. It's not just about the history. So the prophecies that have relevance to the future, not just to the time they're spoken, but to the future, are part of the canon. So Yirmiyahu's prophecies about destruction, but also about consolation, the things that we take with us. And he's addressing not just the people that he speaks to, but we see him as addressing all generations over time, including ourselves. So we see this as a relevant book, even though in terms of his own life, one could say it's rather a tragic life, because at the end of the day, he goes down to Mitzrayim, which is the last place, and it's sort of an unwinding of history. You're going back to where you first started out, and the focus in Yirmiyahu, which is not the focus in the Chumash, by the way, it's much more a focus in the other texts talking about Mitzrayim, because when you read the Chumash, we're in the middle of all these stories now about, Yetzias Mitzrayim and all that. There isn't a direct sense in the Torah, I think, that in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people are engaged in some kind of idolatry. It's very hard to find that in Sefer Shemot, that the Jews are engaged in the idolatries of Egypt. It is true that in Sefer Shemot, you can read that in the sense that when they leave Egypt, one of the first things they do after they leave Egypt is to make a golden calf. And they say, and not only that, it's made out of the gold they took from Egypt. So there's no doubt that you can read in Sefer Shemot that there is a problem with assimilation and assimilating to, and they want to go back to Egypt. So they want to go back to the culture. It's not just because they got food when they were working, as they put it. And God does say, we read this recently, that God says, my war is not just against Paro, but against the gods of Egypt. And there's a fair amount written, and I think it's very important to cite this, that many of the plagues are directed against the gods of Egypt, especially the last plague, the ninth, which is the Choshech, the darkness, and the sun god in Egypt was a very central god, and the name of the sun god actually is Ra. And there's a lot of plays in Sefer Shemot on the word Ra. Ki Ra reged penechem, Moshe tzis otam bira, and there's many other such statements in Sefer Shemot, which suggests to us that the book of Shemot intends itself to be read, among other things, as a polemic against the gods of Egypt. And the question then would be to what degree the Jews in Egypt are part and parcel of the idolatry of Egypt. So I would say the following, that when you read the Chumash itself, you don't get a sense that the Jews are deeply enmeshed in the idolatry of Egypt. But there are other texts of our Bible which do suggest that in Mitzrayim we had sort of become part of the culture and we had adopted some of the practices of Mitzrayim. That's as far as that is concerned. In any event, so I'm coming back to our Yirmiyahu. So the beginning of the book says what time he prophesies, and it more or less overlaps with Yechezkel. Now, I wanted to make a different point about, we'll come back to Yechezkel very often, because these two prophets are actually contemporaries, and many of the prophecies are very similar. They're very different in tone, in language, etc. But many of the prophecies are similar, and we'll have an opportunity to deal with that as well. That's important for us. So the main difference between Yechezkel and, the many differences, one of the important things to recognize is the following with Yirmiyahu as opposed to Yechezkel. For Yechezkel, the book of Yechezkel, the key event in terms of the tragedy of the Jewish people, the key event is not the destruction of the temple. For Yechezkel, that's not the key event at all, for two reasons. One of which is extremely interesting. I don't want to say everything now, but the main event for Yechezkel, and in the Yechezkel's book is chronological for the most part. Yirmiyahu is not chronological. Yirmiyahu is constantly jumping around. It's not in chronological order, say for Yirmiyahu. But Yechezkel is in chronological order. And the important event for Yechezkel, critical event, is not the destruction of the temple. It's the first exile. It's the exile of Yehoiachin. Yehoiachin is only as a king for 3 months. He's also called Yechanya. The Megillah mentions him. That Mordechai was Mordechai was exiled. Im Yechanya melech Yehuda. Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. How that works out in the chronology of the Book of Esther is a wonderful question. It's off by about 100 years, but both for external evidence and internal evidence, not our problem. But that's Yechanya. So Yechanya is mentioned. Mordechai was exiled with Yechanya, to which you see that Mordechai is an important person, because the exile of Yechanya was the important people in government, the Charash Umasger, the craftsmen, the smiths. And I think for the Babylonians, actually, that was the critical event. Jews have their little temple or don't have their little temple, okay, that's fine. But Yechanya, Yehoiachin is the critical event, and Yechezkel measures everything by Yechanya. And in fact, even in Yirmiyahu, the last chapter of the book of Yirmiyahu, which is very interesting, the last chapter of, we'll deal also with how the book is the structure of Yirmiyahu too, it's interesting. But the last chapter of Yirmiyahu essentially is is a chapter from the book of Malachim. It seems like it's appended to the book of Yirmiyahu. It's just simply it. And the end of Malachim, the last verse of Yirmiyahu, we talked about the first verse, and the last verse of Yirmiyahu, the very end, which is chapter 52, which is a straight up chapter from Malachim, it's simply appended to the book. The last verse, or two verses, tell us that Yehoiachin, who's in jail all this time, they didn't kill him, he kept him in jail. They take him out of jail. This is 4 verses before the end of the book. Kela is the jail. So they take him out of jail. The king, there's a new king, Evil Mirodach, the king of Bavel, takes him out of jail, speaks to him with kindness or whatever, with favor or kindness. And it says, Vayitenet kiso mimal ukisei hamulachim asher ito bebavel. And he puts his kisei, his throne, higher than the other kings in Bavel. It's the Yosef story. It's also exactly the language used in the Megillah Esther for Haman. It's exactly the language which Fish actually points that out. That's a very important point. He points the beginning of the Book of Kings and the end of the Book of Kings are very present in the Megillah. Fish was a, I don't know, he's still alive, maybe still. He was an important person in Israel, wrote about the Bible, several articles. His last name is Fish. I forget his first name. Menachem. His son works at Hartman. I have his father's Menachem. There's two of them, the father and the son. The father worked in Tanakh. They're very different. And he does some good work. His last name is Fish. So he's written articles about the Megillah and many other things too. Vishinat big day kilo. He changes his garments. It's the Yosef. Changes the garments, right? And he eats bread with him. Even with Yosef, there's the eating of the bread with Yosef too. Another Megillah term. He gets food every day. So the end of Yirmiyahu, the story of suddenly Yehoiachin, after so many years, is suddenly favored by the king, and he's treated better than all the other captives, and he's given bread to eat every day. And eating bread is not just food, but it's also alliance, it's loyalty, it's allegiance, and all that. There is the intimation at the end of Yirmiyahu of something positive that's going to happen. Yirmiyahu says, 70 years from now, we're going to get out, So the book ends, we like to end our books on more positive notes, even Yirmiyahu. So the last chapter is taken from Malachim. So there's a sense. So my point is that even in the book of Yirmiyahu, the sign that redemption may be not so far away is the status of Yehoiachin. In the book of Yechezkel, Yehoiachin is the critical character. Everything's measured by Yehoiachin in Yechezkel. That's not true in the book of Yirmiyahu. The book of Yirmiyahu, the main focus, I would say, is not on Yehoiachin at all. There is prophecies about the people already in Bavel, that's true. But the focus in Yirmiyahu is much more about what's present in the land of Israel and the destruction of the temple. That's the critical focus. In Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel is different. For Yechezkel, it's Yehoiachin. I would add one point about Yechezkel, which is very interesting. It's a very interesting book, actually. And Yechezkel, I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes. I want to get back to this about the introductions to the two books. We talked about this last semester, but we didn't deal with Yechezkel at all. We dealt with other Hakdoshot, as they're called, not with Yechezkel. So Yechezkel begins with this vision, what the Talmud calls Maseh Merkava, the vision of the chariot. It's a very complicated vision, and it's how the book begins. And one might say it stands in relationship to Yechezkel as it's his first prophecy. I would call it his inaugural prophecy, because it's not just that he has a vision in chapter 1 of Yechezkel. It's that particular vision, that particular event or experience is referred to more than one time in Sefer Yechezkel. And not only is it referred to more than one time in Sefer Yechezkel, but the book ends. The last 9 chapters of Yechezkel are his prophecy or his vision about some new temple. And the temple is a different kind of temple. We're not going to deal with that now. But my point is that it's also a very... the book begins and ends with Yechezkel's vision. Now, the first vision of God's presence, okay, one might say, is the kind of temple vision. That's a very important vision. And the book ends with 9 chapters of this temple, which in many ways is different, both in terms of what it represents and also in terms of specifics. He has many rules about the temple, the sacrifices, etc. And this bothered the rabbinic tradition because they contradict right and left what the Chumash says. There's contradictions all over the place. Yeah, Kohanim can't marry. They can only marry a Grusha for an Almana from another. Totally, right. Of course it's different. And it's different. The sacrifices are all different. The number of sacrifices. He has other days. It contradicts right and left. So the Talmud says they wanted to ban the book of Yechezkel because it contradicts the Torah in other ways too. And they figured out a way to maintain it. But that's for the future. That's a different, not for now. That's Messianic times or whatever it is. But my point is that the book of Yechezkel begins with this vision. So what is the idea of the vision? What is this vision actually? Forget the details, Maseh Merkava. But in general, what is the idea of this? What is he seeing? He sees this chariot with the Ofanim and the Chayot, the all angels, and the Srafim, those three sets of angels that we allude to in our daily prayer service. Ofanim v'Chayot HaKodesh Barash Gadol Mitnasim Uyumat Srafim. So the Ofanim are on the bottom. There's chariots made up of these beings, and the Chayot are on top of that, and above them is the Srafim. And they're all praising God. This is part of what we call Kedusha, right? So it's actually essentially pretty much what it says in the book of Yechezkel. But what is the idea of it? What is Yechezkel seeing in this vision? And what he's seeing in the vision, I think, is the following. The chariot, God's presence is not necessarily situated in any particular place. God's presence can be anywhere. And the truth of the matter is that this idea that God cannot be confined to a place, but God can be any place, is actually, you don't need to go to Yechezkel for that. We have it, we're about to read this in the Chumash. It's called the Mishkan. The Mishkan is God's place, but it's not confined to a specific place. It's wherever God decides to go is where it is. And in point of fact, in the Torah, we can't determine where that place is. As the Torah makes it very clear, when the cloud would just go up, we would travel. And the cloud going up means God has decided to move to a new neighborhood. And we follow. We don't determine where God is. Yes, when you come into the land, that's not practical or whatever, for whatever reasons. Sefer Dvarim is a chosen place. So we have the Mishkan and we have the Mikdash. Nachum Sarn argues, I made the same argument myself many times, that for the Bible, the ideal is actually not the Mikdash. The ideal is the Mishkan. Because as King Shlomo said himself, how can you say God is in any one place? In fact, Shlomo argues God's not even here. God's in heaven. It's a collection point for prayers for Shlomo. So the point of Yechezkel is, it begins with this idea that the presence of God, and this is after, now, this is before the temple has been destroyed. And here we come to a very important point in Sefer Yechezkel. I know we're supposed to be studying Yirmiyah. It doesn't matter. It's all good. And they're deeply connected to each other, these two books. But there is a vision in the book of Yechezkel, beginning in chapter 8, which is an amazing thing, where Yechezkel is actually taken to the temple. He's in Bavel, and he sees himself in this vision as being brought to the temple. He's brought to the temple. And God says to Yechezkel, go and see what they're doing in my temple. Well, yeah, in Yerushalayim. Go and see what they're doing. He makes a hole in the wall and he peers through. And he sees people doing bad stuff. He sees at the entrance to the temple some kind of idolatry. Then God says to Yirmiyah, to Yechezkel, you think you've seen bad things? I'll show you worse. And there are four things that he sees in the temple. He sees the people bowing down to images. He sees the women doing idolatrous stuff, all kinds of terrible things, bowing down to the sun, facing the other direction away from the Holy of Holies and bowing down to the sun. And then, okay, that's chapter 8, it's terrible. And then, what he sees the chariot coming to the temple, and he sees God leaving the temple. The Kruvim actually leave. The Kruvim, they actually get up and they leave. The chariot picks him up. The train is arriving, and goodbye. And it describes in detail how God is leaving the temple. Now you have to understand, this is several years before the temple is actually destroyed. So the point of Yechezkel, and this is like very central to the book, is that before the temple is destroyed, there is no temple. It's actually empty already. There is no temple. So for Yechezkel, the actual physical destruction of the temple is secondary, because as far as he's concerned, there is no temple. That's not true in Yirmiyahu. The temple's being defiled and all that, but it's still a temple. In Sefer Yirmiyah, that's clear. But in Yechezkel, it's very different. It's actually a stunning set of chapters over there. You actually have God leaving the temple. So that's Yechezkel. So for Yechezkel, my point is, that for Sefer Yechezkel, the critical event is not the destruction of the temple. The critical event for Yechezkel actually is the earlier exile, the exile of Yehoiachin. That's what's critical to them, and it would appear that's what's critical to the Nebuchadnezzar too. The little temple of the Jews, or whatever, the little whatever. That's not the main thing. The main thing is for Yirmiyah, our book. That's a different story. For our book, there's a big focus on the actual destruction of the temple, as evidenced, for example, by 2 chapters that are dedicated to the same thing. There are 2 chapters that we studied this last semester, chapter 7 and chapter 26, that in those 2 chapters, which are parallel chapters, he goes to the temple. He goes to Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and he makes the following proclamation. You think this temple can't be destroyed. But let me tell you something. It can be destroyed. And in fact, we've already had in our history a similar situation, which is Shiloh. Because Shiloh was there for many years, and Shiloh was the temple, and people thought it could never be destroyed, and it was destroyed. And the same thing is true of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem. You may think it can't be destroyed, but it can be destroyed the way Shiloh was destroyed. That's what he says in chapter 7. And in chapter 7, there's no seeming response to what he's saying. Probably people didn't like it, but then you get to chapter 26. No, Yirmiyah. And in Yirmiyah, in chapter 26, we have the identical story. He's instructed to go to the temple and to tell them that it will be destroyed, and you think it won't be destroyed. But you said the same thing about Shiloh. That's chapter 26. And in chapter 26, they try to kill him. In chapter 7, when he says it, for whatever reason, we'll talk about this, the way the book is structured, actually. In 7, there's no seeming response to what he's saying. Not that they like it, but they ignore him. But in 26, the description there is different. The description is that when he says that's the very same prophecy that he said in 7, he says in 26, they try to kill Yirmiyahu. And here we come to something which is unique and very special. Maybe unique's the wrong word, but very central to the book of Yirmiyahu. And that is that his prophecies and his own personal history are actually bound together. So I wanted to speak about that by way of introduction to our study, coming back to the beginning of the book that we had spoken about in the past, because we have in the beginning of Sefer Yirmiyahu his calling. God speaks to Yirmiyahu in the first chapter. Vayidvar Hashem Elai Lemar. It's how it begins. The word of God came to me. Yirmiyahu is talking. B'terem etzacha mibeten v'beten yidaticha. V'terem tetzei merechem hiktashticha. Navi lagoyim netaticha. That's how the book begins. So God says to Yirmiyahu, I created you before you were born. I selected you. I knew you. I selected you to be my spokesperson even before you were born. B'terem tetzei merechem hiktashticha. I appointed you, I dedicated you, I'd say, literally consecrated you, sanctified you, but dedicated you. Navi lagoyim netaticha. I have appointed you as a prophet unto the nations. Unto the nations means primarily Israel. That's his main. But like all the great prophets, he prophesies to the other nations as well. Yeshayahu, Yirmiyah, Yechezkel all have prophecies to the nations. And each one has several chapters dedicated to different nations. From a structural standpoint, they're not the same. From a structural standpoint, Yeshayahu and Yechezkel are the same. And Yirmiyah is different and Yirmiyah is different than anybody. Because the prophecies to the nations for Yeshayahu and Yechezkel and the other prophets where it appears, Zephaniah has a couple of lines as well, little Zephaniah. They appear in the middle of the book, always in the middle. Yeshayahu is what chapter 14 or so, goes for about 7-8 chapters. Yechezkel in the middle of the book, a little later, but the middle, not the end. In the case of Yirmiyahu, we'll talk about this in the future, the prophecies to the nation are the end of the book. We don't have this with anybody else. The book ends actually outside the last chapter, which is just a appended chapter from Malachim. But outside of that, the last prophecies of Yirmiyahu are about Bavel. Two long chapters about Bavel. So that right away is different. So maybe over the course we discuss a bit about what that signifies for us. What?
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
I think what you said, the difference between Yirmiyahu talking mainly about the destruction of the temple versus Yehezkel talking about Yoyachin. So Yoyachin, I think, symbolizes the end of sovereignty.
Yes.
Because he's the last king of
Yes.
David.
Yes.
So the question is, if David is our king, is our kingdom, is our sovereignty going to reappear, or is it the end actually?
Right.
Because if we don't have Malchut David, even if we stay in Eretz Israel, it's really a diaspora as far as sovereignty goes. So I think Yirmiyahu is a product of Eretz Israel really. And in Eretz Israel, it's an agrarian society, and people are very, like agrarian people, they are very, they don't have this abstract thinking. They are more materialistic in the thinking also. So it's about the Mikdash, it is very distracted and so on. But Yehezkel is already a product of Babel, and Babel is the center of the intellectual world. And it's very urban, and it's very literate, and so his mind is working like he's a real Babylonian already. After there is a 12 years difference between the first Yoyachin exile and the destruction of the temple. It's like 12 years, if you think about it. This is 1699, and this is 1586, so 12, 13 years.
I think it's more than that. I think it's thinking about Yehoiakim. I think it's 22 altogether, but I think it's yeah.
Basically, I think it's
okay. Let me. It doesn't matter the years, but the point you're making is actually an interesting point. The point you're making is that for you, the claim is that Yehezkel is thinking more conceptually, and that Yirmiyahu thinks more from a practical standpoint. The other part of it is that, as you say, Yehezkel is talking to people who are not in the land. Yehezkel's primary audience are people in exile. So he's talking to the people in exile. No, I understand that. That's true. But I would say in addition to that, what he's saying to the people in exile is, he's talking like a person in exile. He's saying the people in the land are also in exile. They don't know it necessarily. But at the end of the day, their situation and your situation aren't that different. And you could also argue, some have argued, that what he's saying to the people in exile is, don't think of yourself as second-class citizens. It's clear, by the way, and we'll see this, that the people in the land think of the people outside the land as second-class citizens. We are the real Jews, right? Exactly. We are the real Jews, which is very dangerous thinking. And the fact of the matter is that, so what he's saying, what Yehezkel is saying actually is, don't think of it that way. They may be in the land, but being in the land means being in God's presence. But let me tell you a little secret. God has already left the temple. They don't know it. They don't know that. But this temple of God is no longer the temple of God. Your point is a very interesting point about, the kind of chutz la'aretz thinking in general and being in the land in general. And that's actually a very interesting, big question. Okay, let me get back. Let me now begin with, just to reframe this a bit and talk a bit about the structure of Yirmiyahu. So the way the narratives of the Bible work, and I don't think that Yirmiyahu is a funny kind of book. It is a prophetic book. There's a lot of poetry. There's also a lot of prose in Yirmiyahu. There's also a story in Yirmiyahu. It's unlike the other prophets. We know a little bit about Yeshayahu, but we don't know that much about Yeshayahu. There's no sense in the 66 chapters of Isaiah, first Isaiah, second Isaiah, three Isaiahs, I don't care. But at the end of the day, outside of his interaction with King Chizkiyahu for several chapters, there's very little about his interaction with the powers that be. In this long book, very, very little about it. With Yirmiyahu, it's at every turn. Yirmiyahu, at every turn, there is an interaction. So Yirmiyahu is a great prophetic book. It's also a story. And the way the books of the Bible work in general, as we know, is that one text recalls another text, sometimes several texts. So in thinking about a particular book, we're also thinking more globally about other books, about other concepts which are related. So this great book of prophecy, which is Yirmiyahu, you can't talk about prophecy without talking about the great prophet. And in that tradition, the great prophet is Moshe. So the character of Moshe, there is no other Moshe. He's unique. But the different pieces of Moshe play out in different ways. So I want to make a point about how Moshe plays out. Yes.
It's an interesting point that actually the God of Israel is starting to prophesy toward the nations at the point that the Jewish nation is losing its integrity as a separate nation on its own turf. It's about to actually be in exile amongst nations.
That is a good point. It's that I think I don't want to jump the gun too much, but I think what's interesting about Yirmiyahu's prophecies about the nations, as opposed to other prophecies about the nations, that Yirmiyahu has a bit of a different spin on it. And that's because it's located in a different place. I mean, the larger question is, which you raise implicitly, to what degree is the prophecy about the nations, and to what degree is the prophecy about the nations about Israel? I'm reminded, for example, there's a prayer for that many synagogues say for the government, which I don't like at all. But I'm davening for the Yom, I have to say it, but otherwise I would never say it. Because what it says basically is that God should give the government wisdom so that the Jews do okay. That's the basic idea of it. I'm certainly not opposed to the Jews doing okay, but don't get me wrong. But I don't think that's the whole story. Wouldn't you want the people in government to make good decisions for the world and be compassionate, kind, and fair? Whether the Jews benefit mostly from that, I understand why it's written, because they're living in Tsarist Russia. That is a good prayer, they're trying to murder us and not just Tsarist Russia. But in any event, the related question would be, when Yirmiyahu prophesies about the nations or the other prophets, is it just about us? It's about Israel's relationship to the nations, or is there some prophecy about the nations as well? Now, in Yirmiyahu, I do believe that actually, to some extent, he prophesies about the nations, which I think is unique. He actually talks about these nations, about them, forget us. He has an independent prophecy about the nations. I think that's less true, perhaps, of other prophets. But in any event, we'll get there. Let me just get back to this picture of Moshe as the great.
Maybe in Zechariah also, you see that actually that God is acknowledging that you're not on my page, but already around the world I'm being served.
That's right. No, we have several statements like that. That's true. You have almost has it too, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Look. Do I feel different? No. But by the way, there are people that don't like to say these things. The idea that God should grant wisdom to the leadership, I find it very hard to disagree with that. How can anybody disagree that God should grant wisdom to the leaders, whether we like the leaders or don't like them? I'm not crazy about this Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu business. I'm not crazy about that. Yes, I have a very simple theology. I'll tell you my theology in 2 words. Not that it makes a difference, but I'll tell you anyway. My theology is that when it comes to God's plans for the world and the nature of God, I have 2 pieces of theology. First is I know nothing. And the second is I don't believe anybody else knows very much more. That's my theology. It's very simple. It can't happen. It will happen. It happened for this reason. I don't believe that. I don't believe that we can actually know. I think we do the best we can do. Is this the beginning of our redemptive process or not? I have absolutely no idea. Halavai, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I think that those big statements are problematic. I don't see the point to say that. I could say that, thank God we have a place, that we're going to do the best we can and try to create a just society And yes, it has been a safe haven and is a safe haven for refugees and for Jews in particular, 100%. That's no doubt. So, look, I would say the following. I have a lot of problems with the other prayers too. I wouldn't limit myself to this, you know what I mean? Anyway, so there are two ways to understand it. You can try to interpret. We have our standard text. It requires often for us, each one's in a different place. But for me anyway, personally, I try to interpret it a certain way. And the second part is, I think that, and this is, I don't want to get into this now, but in terms of prayer, I think it's a certain mindset. I call it a mythic mindset. When I'm praying that God should restore the sacrifices, and we should bring the sacrifices to the base of Mikdash, you can understand that two different ways. One is, some people actually want it, okay, but if you don't really want it, you can reinterpret it, or you can say something different, which is, I may not want it 5 minutes after I finish praying, but when I'm praying, I put myself in a different world. When I'm praying Yom Kippur, I'm in that base of Mikdash, and the Kohen Gadol performs the avoda. It's true that afterwards it's different, but I'm entering into a mythic world. Same thing is true. There's a Malava Malka, and by Malava Malka, Yaakov Avinu was there. He's actually there. Now he's not there afterwards, but when you're experiencing the Malava Malka, you experience that Yaakov is there, and David HaMelech is there, and Eli Hanavi is there, and that kind of putting yourself in that space. That's one of the great failures of modern Orthodoxy. They have zero understanding of this on any level. Zero. There are many other failures too. But the point is, that's one of the great, there's no understanding of that whatsoever. And within some other communities, they actually understand it. The mythic side. Remember what Kalbach said once during Yizkor. The souls are here, he said. And my nephew went to Otniel, and two of his friends were killed by terrorists. They actually saved the yeshiva. And at his wedding, where the people are here, my great-grandparents are with us. The Kedoshim from Otniel are here. He didn't mean in some metaphorical sense. He meant it literally. They're actually here. That's where his head is at. They're with us today. And that's a different kind of thinking. So this is all a digression in any event, but I think to be able to put yourself in that space, you leave it afterwards, but then it affects you in some way. To be able to enter into that place, that's my understanding of prayer when it works. That's part of it. The act of interpretation is necessary as well, I think. But yeah. Okay. Anyway, let's get back to our story. What time is it now? First of all, these
5 to 11.
Okay, let me get back to the point I want to make about Yirmiyahu now. The great prophet is Moshe, and Moshe, different texts pick up different pieces of Moshe. For example, let's say the narrative texts of our Bible. There are a constellation, what I call constellation of characters. There's Moshe. Then there's Shmuel. The character of Shmuel, in many ways, is based on Moshe. It's very similar to Moshe in many ways. He's brought up, he's handed off to somebody else after birth, only after his mother nurses him and gives him and trains him and gives him the teaching, etc. It's not nursing, it's not just biological. Chana insists, I must nurse him first before he's handed over. In terms of his own personal life, his family life, he doesn't have successors, same as Moshe. The way he connects to God in a very powerful way is a Moshe kind of way. He talks in that one chapter, serve God alone, levado. And b'chol levavchem, he says, those are Moshe terms, those are Sefer Devarim terms. The single-minded, the incredible devotion. And he's a prophet. And he's a prophet at a time when there are no prophets, because God isn't talking. And not only is he a prophet when there are no prophets, he also, after he becomes a prophet, we discover many other prophets. There are bands of prophets suddenly, same as Moshe. Moshe's a prophet, and when Moshe complained to God, I can't do it myself, gather 70 elders to the camp, and I'll place your spirit upon them. And Shmuel also is a prophet who's a leader of prophets. That's clear. So David runs away to Shmuel, Shmuel's there, and his prophets are there as well, and Shmuel is the chief prophet. So in all of those ways, there are parallels, and the language, much of the language of the, and the story of the choosing of Shmuel. Shmuel is chosen, like Yirmiyahu is chosen. And the choosing of Shmuel is based on the sneh. It's the burning bush, the hineni, the fire that's flickering, etc., etc., etc. An interesting study in the book of Shmuel would be to see which verses of the Torah the book of Shmuel co-opts. It's very interesting, and I maintain that in the beginning of his career, the verses that are co-opted are totally positive. But Yitzhak Mosham, the sneh, he is Ne'eman, Chobot Beiti Ne'emanhu, that's all positive, chapter 3. Later in the book of Samuel, when Samuel was much more problematic character, then suddenly we find other verses that are taken from the Torah, and they're more problematic. So that it's actually interesting to see. I'm not claiming that Shmuel is Moshe. The Psalms connect them. Moshe v'Aaron b'Kohanav, u'Shmuel b'Korei Shemo. The power of prayer. Samuel has the power of prayer. He's like his mother. Deep connection to God, great ability to pray. That's another Moshe quality. Is he Moshe? No. The book of Shmuel describes him in many ways as a failure in terms of his, and here we come to an important difference, and you mentioned Baruch before, an important difference between Moshe and Shmuel. Very important difference, and Yirmiyahu figures in this too. And that is that what Moshe is able to do is to pass on his leadership to somebody else. He finds a successor. It's not his kids, but he has a pupil. His pupil is Yoshua. It is true that Moshe has some misgivings about his own pupil. That is true. But at the end of the day, he has a devoted disciple, and the disciple takes over. And the words of the Torah, Moshe died, Yoshua took over, and everybody did. Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. So Yoshua's ability actually is to keep the tradition going, and the teachings of Moses live. It's reflected in Pirkei Avot. Moshe kibod Torah misini Masor Yoshua. Joshua is the example of a incredibly devoted student who is able to transmit the teachings of his Rebbe. That's true of Yoshua, but Moshe is able to transmit it to you. That Shmuel is not so. In the case of Shmuel, the sons are no good, we know. But if Shmuel has a protege of sorts, if he has such a thing, some disciple, it would be Saul. Saul is the one that meets Shmuel. Shmuel says, I'll tell you what to do. And for whatever reason, not our problem now, it doesn't work. For whatever reason, there's a failure. The two can't get along. At the end of the day, the kingship, which is set up as a joint effort, is a failure. So we don't have, in the case of Shmuel, unlike Moshe, for example, we don't have the ability to transmit from the Rebbe to the pupil. We do not have that. We'll get to Yirmiyahu because Yirmiyahu is very interesting. Now, let me just for a second. Let me just finish this thought. So Shmuel and Moshe are in one constellation. Now there's another character. Character number 3, who's a Moses character in terms of the narratives. 100% Moses character. Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi is a Moshe character completely, to the extent, actually, he's also similar. Again, they're not the same. But basically, Eliyahu Hanavi has a quality which often helps people in their. I've seen this in business, by the way. Successful business people. They're single-minded. They have a focus, incredible focus. And if you're inside their focus, that's great. If you're not, you don't exist, basically. But the point is, single-minded people. They know what they want exactly, and they're focused on it, and they work towards it. Eliyahu Hanavi in the religious realm is a single-minded person. He says it straight up. You can't serve two masters. You got to make a choice. It's one or the other. And that's what he says to the people at Mount Carmel. You want Baal, choose Baal. You want God, choose God. You can't have both. It's one or the other. That's very much a Shmuel statement. Serve God alone. And I would say that for Shmuel, by the way, it's very interesting. Chapter 7. Shmuel turns to the people and says, If you want to serve God with all your heart, you serve God alone. Get rid of the idols. And that takes place in the book of Shmuel, 20 years after the ark has been removed from the public sphere. The ark from the book of Shmuel is like the luchot of Moshe carrying down the mountain. It's another Moshe Shmuel connection. The Torah itself can become avodah zarah. That's a very important point. Can become avodah zarah. That's what our teacher Moses taught us when he broke God's tablets. If I give them the tablets, they'll think somehow they have God in their, but they're worshiping a golden calf. What does that even mean? Shmuel's the same way. Once the ark is removed from the public, because the people think the ark is magic. Ark's going to save them. If the ark is with us, God is with us. And Shmuel says that's not the case. You got to remove all the idols, the Asherah and the Baal, and the Aron Kodesh. It's all the same, at least at this point, because that's how they think. So Eliyahu is the third character in the constellation. He's the third character. And in fact, if you remember the story of Eliyahu, one of the truly great chapters of the Bible, so Eliyahu after Mount Carmel, which is 18. In chapter 19, Eliyahu runs off to the desert because Jezebel wants to kill him. And he wants to die. So he goes to sleep in the desert, and the angel wakes him up. And the angel says, you have to eat. He goes back to sleep, he eats, and then he walks to Mount Sinai. He doesn't eat for 40 days and 40 nights. He walks without eating for 40 days. Eliyahu, it's exactly the story of Moshe. And he goes into the mountain, to Har Sinai, and he goes into the cave where Moshe went into. Nikrat Atzur. Why are you here, Eliyahu? God says to him twice. The people have abandoned you. I'm the only person left in this world, he says. I'm the only one. Levad. I'm Levad. That's it. And God says, no, you're not Levad. Go back and you have a disciple. And he meets his disciple, whom he doesn't trust, but he meets his disciple. His name is Elisha. Elisha and Yoshua are the same name. So he has a disciple. He also has misgivings about his disciple. And by the way, the character of Eliyahu can be seen very well when he meets Elisha. It's very powerful. He meets Elisha. He throws his mantle over him, his coat, puts his coat on Elisha, the same way Moses put his hands on Yoshua. And Elisha says, I will follow you. Let me kiss my parents goodbye. Go ahead. What have I done to you? He says. Dismisses it. He ridicules it. His point is, I am your parent. That's his point. And in fact, that's what Elisha says when he ascends to heaven. Avi, Avi, Rechib Yisrael Parashav. I am your mother. I am your father. I think that's in the Christian Bible. I think Jesus said that. Point is, it's a certain mindset. You have no other connections. I'm your only connection because I link you to God. That's all that matters. Nothing else makes a difference. Now, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. That's not relevant here. What I'm saying is the character of Moshe is there's a constellation. There's Shmuel, there's Eliyahu. They're different in many ways. No one is Moshe. They don't have Moshe's kindnesses towards his people and the compassion. They don't have that actually. But they are in that framework. There's also a fourth character who's a Moshe character, by the way. There's also an Eliyahu character. Who's that? Who's the fourth in the constellation? Yirmiyahu is a Moshe character. We'll get to that, but different. But leaving the great prophets out. This guy is a prophet. I wouldn't call him a great prophet. Jonah. Jonah is a Moshe character. He's an anti-Moshe character. He doesn't like the Yud Gimel Midos. He dislikes them. Well, the emes is missing. Right. His name is Ben Amitai, right? I think Devorah wrote about this at one point. But the point is, his name is Yonah Ben Amitai. Truth, right? By the way, it's interesting that in our tradition, Eliyahu HaNavi occupies a pretty important place in Jewish tradition over time. And he becomes, I would say, transformed over time as well. Because in the Bible, I would call him a kind of, if I had two words to describe Eliyahu HaNavi, I would say bitter is one, and a hermit is the other. He's a bitter hermit in the Bible. He's a very bitter person. In our tradition, he becomes the fellow that comes to every time there's a bris, he's there, you know what I mean? So, and what's interesting is that on Motzei Shabbat, he's of course, the one who will bring in the redemption. And there's a song we sing. Actually, Eliyahu Hanavi figures in some of the Zmiras of B'lava Malka. We should do a B'lava Malka sometime. It's very interesting. So one of the songs we sing, one of the songs, probably Eliyahu Hanavi, but there's a song, Ish Chasid Haya. With Ish Chasid Haya. So Ish Chasid Haya is a very good nigunim for that. Brasil has a very good nigun for it, and Mudgetz has a great nigun for it. And Eliyahu in that story is the one who helps the poor Jew, the poor scholar. He helps them out. That's one of his. At the Gemara, you already have this, and he's called in the song Ufaracho Ish Ha'emes. He's the person of truth, Isha Emes. So you see that Eliyahu, right? What does the Medrash say? Yonah ben Amittai is the one that Eliyahu revives, which means he's like his son, basically. So there's a constellation of characters. I mentioned in the narratives, there are 4 characters here. There's Moshe, of course, Shmuel and Eliyahu, obviously. And by the way, Shmuel and Eliyahu have their own internal connections as well. Because once you have the constellation, it's not just A, B, C, D, but there's A, B plays off A, C plays off A, and C and B are connected as well. Not a problem now. That's as far as that's concerned. And now we come to Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel. Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel also play off Moshe, but in different ways. First, I mentioned Yecheskel briefly, and then Yirmiyahu, and then we'll stop with this. So Yecheskel is interesting. Somebody think about Moshe's birth and Book of Exodus that we're reading now. The Book of Exodus begins with revelation and ends with revelation. It begins with a mini revelation, which is the sneh. At the sneh, when Moshe alone sees God, God reveals God to Moshe at the little sneh, and there God tells Moshe that someday you'll come back to this mountain. This is the sign. Someday you'll come back to this mountain. The mountain in which Moshe is found in the sneh is Sinai. Sneh and Sinai are related. So the book begins with a little teeny revelation, right? And the book ends with the great revelation, both the revelation at Har Sinai, and then the book ends with the Mishkan, which is God continues to speak after Sinai. As the Ramban formulated it, the Mishkan is God continuing to speak. After the great revelation, God doesn't stop talking. God will continue to speak, to command afterwards through the Mishkan. And the last verse of the book of Exodus talks about God's presence, right? What's the last verse of Sefer Shemot? We're reading it right now. The last pasuk in Sefer Shemot is about God's. Yeah, let's read the last. Where's the last pasuk there? It's there. The last pasuk is Anan Hashem al Mishkan Yomam v'yesh Layla bo li'enei kol Beit Yisrael b'chol masehem. Right? A cloud of God rested by day, a fire would appear in the night, in the view of all of the house of Israel throughout their journey. So God is seen by all of Israel, not just the one person that is sneh. So the book begins with a revelation, and the book ends with a revelation, which is how the book of Yecheskel, as I mentioned before. That's Sefer Yecheskel. It starts with his revelation, his personal revelation, only to him. But then his vision about the temple. The temple is a temple not just for one person. The temple is a temple for all of Israel, to the extent that in Yecheskel's vision, everything surrounds the temple. He reapportions the whole land, and the waters are coming out from the temple and extending beyond the holy waters, extend every place. So it's exactly the frame of the book of Shemot, of Sefer Shemot. Starts with a personal revelation, it ends with the great revelation. That's as far as Yecheskel playing off the Moshe character. But in the case of Yirmiyahu, though, and that's what makes this a very powerful book, I think, Yirmiyahu, is that there's something different about it. Now, it does start with a revelation. And the revelation that's given to Yirmiyahu in the beginning of the book reminds us of Moshe in the sense that when Moshe is called by God, Moshe refuses. Moshe doesn't want to do it. And it goes on for 2 chapters, basically. He has a million excuses. Mi anochi, who am I to do this? He says, and I can't talk so well. They're not going to believe me. I have no standing. Get somebody else. You know what I mean? He has all kinds of excuses, which mean, among other things, when someone gives you 5 excuses why they don't want to do something, usually the real reason is something else. It's not one of the five. It's usually six. And we can understand why Moshe wouldn't want to go. I can think of two reasons he wouldn't want to go. First of all, he's perfectly happy where he is. He has met this fellow Yitro who loves him, and he loves Yitro, and for all the right reasons too, because they basically agree about the world. They basically care about justice, protecting the weak, right? So basically they get along very beautifully. He's a priest. One might say Moses' first Rabbi was the priest of Midian. It could be so, could be formulated that way. Number two, the people that he's going to be sent back to save are the people who one way or the other have rejected him. Who made you the boss? They say to him. And not only that, it would appear in the Chumash that either directly or indirectly, they are responsible for Paro finding out that Moshe killed the Egyptian. Who made you? You going to kill us the way you're going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? Says Moshe, oh, the davar is known. Next verse. So indirectly or directly, they either inform on him or they're talking. They're not keeping it quiet. We talk a lot, people hear. The Medrash goes even further. How would the guy know what Moshe did? How would he know that Moshe said, looked around, there was nobody there. How did the guy know that Moshe killed the Egyptian? That he criticizes him. Says the Medrash, he was the one Moshe saved. That's Medrash, So ingratitude has no bounds, He's the one he saved. So in any event, we understand, but Moshe doesn't, whatever reasons, he doesn't want to take the. Now, in the case of Yirmiyahu, we don't have an extended refusal. In the case of Yirmiyahu, he says, I'm a nar. You got the wrong guy. That's okay, says God. I'm going to help you. As God says to Moshe, I can't talk. What do you mean you can't talk? Who created speech? I'll help you. So to that extent, it's very similar. And I would say the deeper point is, and this is the very deep point over here, and Yirmiyahu actually says this later on in the book. You read a book and something stands out for us as to what is central to the book. And there's a verse that Yirmiyahu says later on. It's either chapter 10 or 11. I could find it, but I'll paraphrase it. A person doesn't choose his own mission. We don't decide what we do in this world. That's what Yirmiyahu says. He says, I have a task to do. It's very unpleasant. He doesn't like his task, and we'll see he tries to resign at one point. Maybe he did resign. We don't choose our path. We're given the path. And that is basic to the book of Yirmiyahu, and that's basic to Moshe. It's not a task Moshe was looking for at all. Quite the opposite. He resists very greatly God's attempt to co-opt him into saving the people. And actually, when you think about it, from many perspectives, it's a completely thankless task. And here we come to one of the central connections of Yirmiyahu and Moshe, which I don't know about you. I don't think about it that much, but I've been thinking about it lately with Yirmiyahu, which is, at the end of the day, Moshe is somebody who takes the people out of Egypt. He teaches the people. He doesn't succeed in the ultimate goal of bringing them into the land, but he sets up the possibility of the next generation, at least, making it into the land. But we shouldn't forget one thing, that throughout the story of Moshe, from beginning pretty much to end, certainly up to Sefer Bamidbar, it's one complaint after the next. The people are constantly criticizing him, and on more than one occasion, Moshe feels that they're actually preparing not just to criticize him with words, but to kill him. As Moshe says, what can I do to this people? Od ba'at skoguni. They're going to kill me. He says, these people are out to get me, So at one point, he actually decides to quit. He says, listen, I can't do this job anymore. You got the wrong guy. I can't take it. And it's constant criticism, constant threats, constant saying, why did you take us out? We told you not to do it, more than one time. So that's the task that Moshe has been given. He didn't volunteer for the task. He was commanded, and he accepts the command. So the character of Moshe actually We have it in the very beginning of Yirmiyahu, but it's very significant because it's not just the beginning where he says, listen, I'm not the right guy. Don't worry about that. I'm going to help you. But it's more than that because it sets the stage for what is true about the entire book, which is that unlike any other prophet, this is a person who I would say two things. Number one, that you have in the book of Yirmiyahu counter prophecies. You have other prophets who are saying the opposite of Yirmiyahu in more than one chapter. That's number one. There are other people out there. Who says you're the real prophet? Maybe we're the real prophets. After all, we outnumber you. We're many, and you're just one. And I was thinking about this morning, that we do have this in the Chumash with Moshe. Not that we have so many other prophets, but we have situations where other prophets are, in a certain sense, countering Moshe in two successive stories in the Chumash. One is where his brother and sister, or where Miriam said to Aaron, is this the only prophet we have? Well, right? We're also prophets. We're also Nevi'im, right? Korach's not a prophet. But the next story, this previous story, Eldad Umeidan. Everybody was commanded to go to the center of the camp to receive Moses' spirit, chapter 11 of Bamidbar. But there are two fellows who don't go to the center of the camp. So they're prophesying in the camp without Moshe's spirit, apparently. So already you see in chapter 11, Miriam and Aaron at chapter 12. But already in 11, you have two people who are prophesying and saying, we're prophets without you. We don't need you to prophesy. And the person runs to Moshe and says, Eldad Umeidan are prophesying in the camp. And Yoshua says, lock them up. Shut them up. Says Moshe, what do I care? Let them all be prophets. But the fact of the matter is, it's dangerous to all be prophets. The Korach's not a prophet, but you have the similar trajectory over there about non-acceptance of Moses' authority. So you have that already with Moshe, and you have it, I would say, intimated by, and clearly it's subject of Sefer Yirmiyahu. So we do have that as well. And of course, on more than one occasion, they try to kill this fellow. They try to kill Yirmiyahu. They put him in one jail. He sees different kinds of jails, and by the way. There were different kinds of jails in the book. Chatzara Matara, there's some jails where you're going to die. They lower him into the pit where he will die. Another Joseph connection. In short, that you don't have in Yechezkel. You don't. Yes.
I wanted to say, I think if we differentiate between just a religious leader and somebody who is also
Political
leader, it sheds light on the differences between these various figures.
I actually spoke about that last semester. I did talk about that.
Yeah, so
because Moshe is not just a prophet. That is true.
but I would argue that Yirmiyahu is also has some side of it as a political leader. And I'll tell you why I say so. Because, I'm involved with stories. You don't have a story of a hero involved with foreign kings unless he has a political side to him. Like Eliyahu, you don't hear him with other kings.
That's true. That's right.
You know what I mean?
Elisha, you do. Not Eliyahu. Right.
He's not involved with the king of Babylon.
Right.
But Yirmiyahu is involved with authorities.
I totally agree with you. 100% agree. Right. I do agree with you. I'm glad you said that because last semester I did make that distinction between just being a prophet on one hand and Moshe, who's a leader and a prophet. But I actually agree with your statement that I would change what I said. I think that not that Yirmiyahu is the leader of the people. There are kings, okay? But there's a political side to him. Because he deals a lot with the kings. He deals with the kings all the time, actually. Unlike Eliyahu, who doesn't. You're right about that. Elisha does. Elisha is dealing with foreign kings, too. He goes to Aram, etc. With Yirmiyahu, it's actually interesting. You have a little with Yeshayahu and Chizkiyahu. You do have that. But with Yirmiyahu, it's much more pronounced. So I think that's a very good point. And that's a good point. Exactly to pinpoint it, I can't. But I do agree. I think it's an important observation that he is not just a prophet talking, giving a sermon on Shabbos morning or something. He deals with the leadership. Well, of course. I mean, Moshe is primarily, he's a leader. His job is to take the people out. He is a teacher. He has a vision, trying to impart the vision. But there are all kinds of political decisions. Moshe has many things, I agree. What you have, what's interesting is that with Yecheskel, you don't have this at all. And there's something else about Yecheskel you don't have. With Yirmiyahu, there's a sense that there are other prophets. There's a conflict. The prophets are out to get him. The king is out to get him. Some people. It's a very, we'll see, it's much more complex. In the case of Yecheskel, there are other prophets. He has a chapter on other prophets. There's never a sense in Yecheskel about him being in any kind of danger whatsoever. No danger for Yecheskel whatsoever. Nor is there any sense in Yecheskel about his own reservations about what he's doing. There's never a sense there that has reservations about it. Is a theatrical event in the beginning.
Is considered by the people.
Right, and God says, you are so fair. You represent something for the people, but there's not a sense actually in Sefer Yecheskel of any kind of internal struggles, of any kind of conflict. Never. What? He has a biography. He's a Kohen. There is some sense about we have to deal with Yecheskel just because in Yirmiyah and Yecheskel are parallel prophets, parallel audiences. There's no sense. What makes Yirmiyah very different is this quality of this Moshe quality of, and it's funny, you read Yirmiyah and suddenly for me, I never thought of it so much that Moshe is someone who people are constantly criticizing him and actually threatening him. And you don't think about it. When you read Yirmiyahu, suddenly it becomes very clear that throughout Moshe's entire life, he is threatened, he's not appreciated, maybe till the very end when they put him on a pedestal and they also ignore him. And at the end of his life, he has one request, basically. Let me go into the land. And that request is not met. He dies in the desert someplace or other. In Yirmiyahu's life, he ends up back in Mitzrayim, actually, is where he ends up. So the two characters are very similar. And I think the purpose here was twofold. First of all, to get some sense, which I think is important, not just for Yirmiyahu in general, of how these texts relate to each other, how the big character, for example, plays out in a whole variety of different ways. That's the way these texts work. There's Shmuel, and there's Eliyahu, and there's Yonah, Yirmiyah, and Yecheskel, others as well. But how these play out. And then, given the fact that both Yecheskel and Yirmiyahu, in some sense, play off Moshe, this is an invitation to us to think much more about the differences between Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel, where they prophesy, what they say, not just about their personalities, but what is the vision that they are putting forward. I'll just say one last point. What time is it now? Is it 11? Okay, we make one last point about Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel, which is, and then next week we'll start dealing with specifics, but it's also very interesting which texts are being cited. The way the Bible works is one text relates to another, that's for sure. So, in the case of Yirmiyahu, for example, the primary text that is referred to in Yirmiyahu is Sefer Devarim, in many interesting ways. Now, Sefer Devarim is also cited by Yecheskel. Sefer Devarim is a book. One might say it's the space in between. One might say Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's the beginnings of reinterpretation, because that's what the book is. The book is a kind of reinterpretation of the past, etc. There's also many chidushim in Sefer Devarim. One might say contradictions to the past, but fundamentally it's a kind of reinterpretation. Having said that, and that's true of both, number one, I say two things. The presence of Sefer Devarim in Yirmiyahu is very pronounced. The language, we'll see that. And number two, what's interesting is that unlike Yirmiyahu, it appears to me I have to look more deeply into this, but from what I've seen so far, is that the book of Vayikra is the book that is very much the center of Sefer Yechezkel. Not so much Yirmiyahu, but Vayikra, and we'll have a chance to see this when we look at the prophecies of Yirmiyahu, and some of them are parallel to Yechezkel. So Sefer Vayikra, they're both Kohanim, they're both priests, but the Kahuna and the Migdash is central to Yechezkel. It is much less central to Yirmiyahu. Restoration, returning to the land, that is much more Yirmiyahu theme. Returning to the temple, returning to be in God's presence, that is much more a Yechezkel theme. Now, there's much more to this, so next week we'll start with some specifics. But okay, right. We will, yes. There are other interesting features. Yechezkel has some very interesting features, different from Yirmiyahu, or anybody else for that matter, about his vision of the future. So we'll also deal with that. What is the vision of the future? Yirmiyahu has one vision, Yechezkel has a very different one. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue next time.